Something about that afternoon felt off long before anyone truly understood just how far everything was about to spiral out of control. In our neighborhood, the HOA had spent years pretending they were the law. They wore badges that meant absolutely nothing, carried radios like real officers, and strutted around the gates as if they owned every street, every driveway, every breath of air behind those fences. Most people just rolled their eyes and kept quiet. It was easier that way, until the day they crossed a line you can never uncross. It began with a visitor pulling up to the front gate. At first, there was nothing dramatic about it. Just a car, a routine stop, and one simple demand from the so-called HOA security team. Open the trunk. Let them search the vehicle. The visitor refused, calmly and politely. That should have been the end of it. But power has a strange effect on people who were never meant to have it. Voices grew louder. Instructions turned into threats. And then someone pulled a trigger. The worst part was they had absolutely no idea who they had just shot. If you had driven through our neighborhood on a normal day, you probably would have thought it was the perfect suburban dream. Clean sidewalks, identical houses lined up like they'd been copied and pasted. Lawns trimmed so precisely they looked measured with a ruler. Everything felt quiet, controlled, almost too perfect to be real. But beneath that calm surface was something most visitors didn't notice right away. The people who believed they controlled everything. The HOA board had slowly evolved from a group that handled landscaping complaints into something far more aggressive. At the center of it all was Karen, the unofficial leader of what she proudly called a security task force. She had gathered a small circle of loyal followers who wore reflective vests, carried radios, and patrolled the neighborhood like they were guarding a military installation instead of a peaceful residential block. They set up checkpoints at the gate, questioned visitors, and issued warnings for things as trivial as a mailbox being the wrong shade of gray. At first, people laughed it off. It seemed ridiculous. But the warnings turned into fines, and the fines turned into intimidation. People stopped pushing back because resisting only made things worse. The HOA patrol fed off that silence. The more people avoided them, the more confident they became. Eventually, they stopped acting like neighbors altogether and started behaving like actual law enforcement. The problem was none of them were. A few days before everything collapsed, I had arranged a meeting with a man named Chris. It was supposed to be routine, just another professional discussion like dozens I'd had before. Still, something about him felt different from the very beginning. He spoke calmly, carefully, like someone used to choosing every word with precision. When I suggested meeting at my office, he declined almost immediately. I offered a cafe downtown instead. Again, he refused, polite but firm. Then he suggested something that caught me completely off guard. He asked if we could meet at my house. Most people prefer the opposite. Offices and cafes feel neutral, public, safe. But Chris didn't seem interested in those kinds of places. He explained that he valued privacy, that he preferred quiet environments where conversations wouldn't be interrupted. His voice carried a confidence that made you stop questioning things too deeply. So I agreed. Even then, there was a strange feeling I couldn't quite explain. He didn't share many personal details. No long introductions, no casual small talk, just a brief message saying he'd arrive Wednesday afternoon and would call when he reached the neighborhood gate. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed he was just a cautious businessman. What I didn't realize was that the moment he pulled up to that gate, everything in our quiet neighborhood was about to explode. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong wasn't the shouting. It was the sound that came before it. A single sharp crack that echoed across the neighborhood, bouncing off the rows of quiet houses. For a split second, everything felt frozen. Then the noise erupted. People yelling, car door slamming, someone shouting from the direction of the gate. My stomach tightened as I rushed down the street. The closer I got, the louder the chaos became. When I finally turned the corner and saw what was happening, my heart nearly stopped. Chris was lying on the ground beside his car. One of the doors hung open, and he was clutching his leg. His hand was already soaked with blood, which was spreading across the pavement. A dark stain pushed to the fabric of his pants, while a small crowd of neighbors stood several feet away, stunned, phones raised, recording everything. Two of the HOA patrol members stood nearby, both wearing those ridiculous reflective vests they treated like official uniforms. One of them still had his gun in his hand. His arms trembled slightly, but his voice came out loud and defensive. He refused the search. He snapped toward the crowd. He wouldn't cooperate. The words sounded absurd even as he said them. A man was bleeding on the ground, and they were still trying to justify it as if they were enforcing parking rules. I pushed through the crowd and dropped beside Chris, pressing my jacket against his wound while people argued and shouted behind me. All around us, phones kept recording, neighbors whispering in disbelief, and those men stood there trying to fend the indefensible. The HOA officers still looked convinced they had done nothing wrong. I looked up at them, disbelief burning hotter than the fear in my chest. "What were you thinking?" I demanded, my voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You shot him over a car search?" The man holding the gun straightened, as if the vest on his shoulders somehow gave him authority. "He refused compliance," he said sharply. "That makes him a threat." A threat? The word echoed in my head as I pressed harder against Chris's wound, trying to slow the bleeding. He hadn't lunged at anyone. He hadn't shouted. From everything I could see, he had simply said no. Behind me, the crowd had grown. More neighbors stepped closer, phones raised, recording every second. The murmur spread through the group like electricity. People were angry now. Shock was turning into outrage. "Put the gun down," someone shouted from the crowd. For a moment, the man hesitated. His partner shifted nervously beside him, glancing at the growing wall of cameras pointed in their direction. The confidence they had carried for months was starting to crack. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they avoided eye contact, in the way their voices lost that commanding edge. Yet the weapon was still there, hovering dangerously close to another disaster. And in that heavy silence, everyone seemed to realize the same thing at once. This wasn't over. The sirens arrived minutes later, slicing through the tension that had settled over the street. Real police officers stepped out of their cruisers, their expressions changing instantly when they saw the scene. An injured man on the pavement, two nervous HOA officers, a crowd of witnesses holding up phones. Questions came immediately. What happened? Who fired the weapon? Why was this man on the ground? One of the patrol members tried to explain, repeating the same line about a refused vehicle search. But the officers weren't convinced. They moved quickly, securing the weapon and kneeling beside Chris while paramedics rushed in. That's when everything changed. One of the officers asked for identification while helping him onto the stretcher. Chris slowly reached into his jacket and handed over his wallet. The officer opened it, glanced down, and froze. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. When the officer looked back up, his entire posture had shifted. His voice dropped as he spoke quietly to his partner. The man they had just shot wasn't some random visitor. He was federal Judge Christopher Lang. By the next morning, the neighborhood that once prided itself on control looked nothing like it had the day before. Word spread faster than anyone could contain. Videos from the scene were already circulating online, showing Chris lying injured while the HOA patrol tried to justify their actions. What had started as a local incident suddenly drew attention far beyond our streets. Then the real authorities arrived. Dark government vehicles rolled through the same entrance gate the HOA had once guarded so proudly. Federal agents stepped out with a calm confidence that instantly shifted the balance of power. They didn't ask many questions at first. They already seemed to know enough. The two men who had called themselves HOA security were taken into custody right there in front of everyone. Their radios, badges, and weapons were collected like props from a failed performance. For the first time since I had known them, they looked small. Investigators began speaking with witnesses, reviewing footage captured by neighbors, and digging through HOA records. Karen's influence vanished almost overnight. The authority she had used to intimidate others collapsed under the weight of real law. And as the investigation unfolded, one truth became impossible to ignore. The moment they fired that shot, the power they believed they had disappeared completely.